Hi, this is Ray Poynter, and I'm going to be giving you a little bit of an overview of listening research. And I'm going to do that in the context of words, because as Dennis Potter said, the trouble with words is that you never know whose mouth they've been in. And this is certainly true in the area of listening research, blog mining, social media research. The same words can mean very different things to different people. Some of the words have got a very specific purpose, others have become rather used and abused in different contexts. So, what do I mean by listening research? Well, I mean collecting together lots of information from blogs, from communities, from Twitter, from Facebook, online review sites, news sites, anywhere where people make comments, where there is a discourse on the web, pulling that together in very large quantities, not the sort of quantities that you or I might sit down and read, but actually vast quantities in some cases. And what we want to do is produce some insight out of that process. So it's a matter of going from thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions, billions of words, and producing insight at a human scale that can be useful to our clients. Other names that this sort of research goes under, some people call it social media research, some call it blog mining, buzz monitoring. Netnography is a term you'll hear used. Sometimes I think it's an inappropriate term. I prefer to use netnography for that part of ethnography that relates to the internet. And web scraping. Web scraping is going to be a phrase we're going to come back to because it's highly descriptive of some techniques, but it's also somewhat pejorative and has some negative overtones. It's interesting that we've fastened on this word listening because actually we're reading most of the time. And we're looking at what people have got. And there's a spectrum of words I put on the screen here. And if I were to say to you, I'm watching you, then you'd probably find that a bit creepy. If I was to say, I'm seeing what you are doing, well, it's probably not quite as bad, but it's still pretty creepy. Listening sounds warm. It sounds as though we're taking on board, we're being empathetic. Possibly, however, in the fullness of time, we should be thinking about hearing research, where we're really internalizing in a way that allows us to respond to people. So not just understanding what they're doing, but really empathizing. Essentially, in listening research, there are two stages. The first is to gather the information, and traditionally this has been known as the corpus, and what we need to do is to get all of that information that we're interested in off the internet or out of survey forms, out of telephone answering systems, out of call center information, wherever it is. We need to get it together in an organized database so that we can actually make sense of it. And this is the big thing that's become really interesting with blog and buzz marketing, social media research, in that there is a growing number of services and different ways of collecting this corpus together. And once we've got our corpus, we then have to analyze it. And essentially, this is a text analytics system. And it's been around for many years now. Before we started talking about social media research and all of these things associated with it, we were talking about computer-aided qualitative data analysis, which is quite an interesting concept in that it brings the word data and the word qualitative together. And essentially, computer-assisted qualitative data analysis is a method of making a qualitative researcher more productive, giving more strength to their arm, allowing them to process more data, probably in a more consistent way. Text analytics moves beyond that, and frequently there isn't a researcher involved. The whole process is as close to automated as we can make it. So how do we go about finding our corpus, our collection of data? Well, there are a range of free methods you can do it. You can use search engines, Google, Bing. You can set up RSS feeds to a wide variety of blogs and news sites, and they will pull the information together, and there are utilities that will allow you to put that into databases. You can set up alerts. I want to know every time my name is mentioned. I want to know every time Starbucks is mentioned. I want to know every time that Queensland and flood or whatever are mentioned in the same sentence, paragraph or article. Manually, I can go out and I can look at sites and I can pull down information. I can go to the various people that I'm in contact with on Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn and pull down information by looking, cut and paste. Or I can use web scraping. Now that's the second time I've mentioned that phrase. Web scraping is a method of going to a site and pulling the information off. So in a very simple example, there are extensions which you can add to your browser that will log into Facebook for you and will pull that information down and put it into a database. That will log into a price compare site and pull that information down and put it into a database. All they are doing is what you would be doing yourself. They do all that copy and paste, the same as you would do, but they automate it and they make it faster. They also, by and large, break the terms and conditions of the sites. Google do not permit them, Facebook do not permit them. So when researchers are using scraping technologies on these sorts of sites, they are breaking those terms and conditions. Now, the reason for that is that sometimes those organizations want to protect the information there. Sometimes they want to make it commercially available for themselves. But also there is a bandwidth implication. If you are sitting down and manually cutting and pasting, you won't make a very heavy load on somebody's server. If, on the other hand, you send a device in that is cutting and pasting automatically, driven by software at your end, effectively a bot, then you are going to start to make demands on their bandwidth. And if lots of people are doing it, then yes, it will start to have an impact on them. However, nearly everybody who does listening research commercially goes to the commercial providers. What do the commercial providers have? Well, they have bots, or sometimes called spiders or robots, that go out over the internet, that crawl around, that find the comments, bring it together and aggregate it into their own databases, which they can make available. So they will typically have standard sites, and they may well have a backlog of history, in some cases a couple of years, of sites that they always go to, so those can be brought and made available very quickly. Normally, if you go to a commercial service, you'll say, right, well, I want all of your standard sites, but actually I really need you to look at these sites as well, because that's where I think people are going to be talking about the product that I'm interested in, the topic that I'm interested in, whatever it is. So the commercial sites will then charge. It's very variable, but it's not as cheap as you probably would expect it to be. You are not going to be talking tens or hundreds of pounds. You're going to be talking about thousands, usually small thousands per month, but it can be very easily more than a few thousand. Let me get to the analysis part. And please, please, please do not think that counting the words is any sensible form of analysis for most qualitative data. It's really what happens when you put quantitative researchers in charge of a large amount of qualitative data. We start counting up the words, and it can look very attractive. This particular chart here was produced by Wordle, which counts all of the words and it puts them in proportion to its size, and it can sometimes be a useful first port of call when doing some analysis. It can be a useful way of summarizing data, but it really isn't analysis of qualitative data. You shouldn't just be looking to count words. Even counting can be made somewhat more intelligent. This is an example from Google Flu Trends. It looks around the internet for where people are searching for cold and flu remedies. The more that people are searching for those, the more it infers that there are people there with flu. It can be used as a predictive tool. When I looked at this one, it was in September, and you would not expect there to be much cold and flu in the southern hemisphere. But if you look at Chile there, bright red hotspot, so I went out and I had a look at the newspapers, and sure enough, there was a flu epidemic at that time in Chile. So this is a much more intelligent way of using counting of information. So what does the commercial process really comprise? Well, the first thing that happens once we've got the corpus is that people look at volume, and that is close to the counting. So words in context, your life is going to be a lot easier if you've got a brand name like Starbucks or Nokia, But if you've got a brand name like Ford, it's going to be somewhat harder because there are so many other mentions that you're going to need to be careful with. Once you start to measure the volume, then the interest becomes in trends. Which phrases are becoming more common in association with your brand? Which words are becoming less common in association with your brand? Are you being frequently mentioned in the same breath as X or Y? Once the volume and the trends have been taken on board, the most important thing and the most difficult thing is to start to assess the sentiment. People are talking about your brand, but are they positive or are they negative? Now, most of the big commercial systems have some automated software for doing this, but there's a lot of dispute about how good it is. Nearly all the high quality work that I see in listening research uses people to a very large extent in the sentiment analysis. It may use machines to make those people more productive, but at the heart of the process, to know whether a statement is truly positive or negative, you are going to have eyes looking at it at some stage. Now that typically means you're going to start sampling the data because there's simply too much data. So you will take a sample of the data and then you will code that by eye. You might then either just use that sample or you'll try to use pattern matching from the manual coding back to the data set. Another very interesting aspect and quite a scary one for market researchers relates to influence. The software, many of the versions of the software will start to tell you who is following whom, who makes the comments that other people retweet, who makes the comments that leads to action. Now from a market researcher's point of view, we're interested in that because we can start to build models of influence, models of how knowledge and power and various initiatives flow through the internet, through the discourse. But marketers can actually do something perhaps even more interesting and scary with it, because if you identify who those people are, and once you know their IP address, once you know their online name and phrase, then you can actually target them. So marketers might much prefer to have the names and addresses of those individuals than knowing about their market research structure, their likes, and so on. And finally, what is it that those influencers are talking about? What sort of content are they interested in? So they're talking about your brand. What else do? They read these magazines. They tend to talk about these features. They're really interested in this. Once we've got that content, we can start to map the volume of that content. Then we can start to look at the trends of the changes in the volume of that content. And you can see how we've got a process in place now. A couple of quick issues that I just need to flag up. One is this listening research is raising a lot of new issues. One of them is the loss of anonymity. If somebody quotes something from a focus group, you will never know who that person was. But if you quote something that's been said on the open internet, then I can find out by using search engines who that person was in many cases. So simply using a literal quote can take away the anonymity that somebody thinks that they have or that we as market researchers think we should be protecting. This particular case here has become quite a famous one. Sometimes people call it Scrapegate. Patients Like Me is a site where people go together and they talk about their health conditions and they find it's therapeutic and there's a community going on there of sharing. And late last year there was a high profile case where it was discovered that Nielsen Buzzmetrics had been going in using a web scraper to collect information from this that they could make available to their client. Now, Nielsen Buzzmetrics have held their hand up and said, no, that was wrong, we apologize unreservedly. But it shows you just how easy it is to make the newspapers. It shows you how easy it is to do something which might superficially seem sensible, but can have enormous repercussions on companies, individuals, and of course the industry. I would also warn you about the overclaims. For those of us from a sort of a more traditional market research background, you'll be surprised at the degree of overclaim from some of the system providers. And this is a press release that I received late last year, and I've just highlighted one or two phrases from it. New technology renders market research focus groups obsolete. Big claim there. The software behind our reports actually reads the entire English language internet and can render opinions from selected subject matters. Now, reading the entire English internet is quite interesting. Google gets to about 0.5% of the internet. Large parts of Facebook are not visible to outside systems because the security settings have been set so they're not visible. The results scan from public articles, commentaries, blogs and social media sites, i.e. Facebook and Twitter, well I've just mentioned Facebook, of which 72% view adding vitamin C as positive, 23% had no position on the subject and 5% viewed the statement negatively. So this is sentiment analysis. One worries slightly that so many people saw it as positive. And of course it's superficially attractive, isn't it? 312,000 people talking about this, 99,000. We must remember our basic market research. What is the population? What sampling system was used? How reliable is it? We like to think of our services as market research 4.0. Well, that's kind of interesting because most hyperbole uses 3.0 because the rest of us are stuck in a 2.0 world. So usually it's enough to put a 3 on, but here we see a 4. The bottom one is scary, not because it's hyperbole, but because it's getting closer to the truth. A client can actually dig down to find out who is actually making these statements on any given topic. In most cases, we can identify individuals and IP addresses. We joke that only the CIA has our technology. Now that's going to raise some really interesting and deep questions for researchers. So with that, I'd like to say thank you, and I look forward to taking your questions.